My dear brothers and sisters in Islam, one of the great qualities of our faith is the strong emphasis that it places on community. When you read the Quran, you're overwhelmed with the sense of community simply in the manner that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses the believers as a whole, as a collective group. In fact, throughout the book of Allah, you will find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses us as the faithful in the plural form approximately 89 times. He addresses those who believe as a collective 89 times, never addressing an individual. Does not address the lone believer in a similar manner. As people of a shared faith, we have joined together in a sacred bond, a sacred bond of fraternity. And we become united as a family of faith. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ إِخْوَةٌ. Indeed, the believers, they're brothers. The believing men are brothers, and the believing women, they are sisters. And that is how community is made, based on faith. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that in Surah Al-Hujurat, verse number 10. The reality of this very unique relationship that we share. Many of us, we come from such diverse backgrounds. If it wasn't for our faith, perhaps we would never meet. We would never cross paths, except that we find ourselves in a place of worship like this on a regular basis, and so we get to know one another and we enjoy each other's company. If it wasn't for Islam, highly unlikely. This relationship was instituted by the Prophet ﷺ shortly after they migrated from Mecca, arriving in Al-Madinah. Immediately after the construction of the masjid, in the home of Anas ibn Malik, the Prophet ﷺ paired a good number of the companions from Mecca with their new counterparts of Medina. In this relationship, they would share housing, they would share food, they would share mutual rights, and they would support one another, to the point that at the time, they were legislated to inherit the other's wealth. This was known as al-mu'akha, which was the brotherhood or the fraternity. And this was a binding relationship. There are numerous examples that you can find during the life of the Prophet ﷺ. Beginning with the great Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. He was partnered with Kharija, who was from the Ansar of Al-Madinah. Umar ibn Khattab radiyallahu anhu was partnered with one of the Ansar named Itban. And those two were not only brothers in faith and they would help each other, but they were also in cooperation pursuing the knowledge of Islam. They would take turns. One of them would go to work while the other sat with the Prophet ﷺ. And then when the day was over, the one who was off to work would come home and they would share what was learned. And then they would alternate days. Umar would go to work one day, Itban would stay with the Prophet ﷺ. The next day, Umar would go with the Prophet ﷺ, and his brother Itban would go to work. Also, Abdurrahman ibn Auf and Sa'd ibn Rabi', some of the great companions that we know very well. Sa'd ibn Rabi' from Al-Madinah, he offered Abdurrahman ibn Auf half of his wealth. When he arrived and became his brother, he said, "Take half of my wealth." He went so far as to say, perhaps as a gesture of good faith, "I'll divorce one of my wives and you can marry her." And Abdurrahman ibn Auf, he said, "May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless your family and bless your wealth. Just show me where the marketplace is and I'll start my business." Successfully so. Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah was partnered with Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, and The scholars of hadith, they mention particularly 90 companions that were bound together by the Prophet ﷺ for the sake of their faith. And, of course, the legal rulings of inheritance, they changed during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ. They were absolved from that relationship. But the bonds of brotherhood, they have remained. And they serve as an integral part of community life. That we see one another as brothers and sisters. This is a relationship that cannot be undermined. It cannot be diminished, but it must be protected and appreciated. And so a number of things were instituted in our faith to preserve that relationship. The Prophet ﷺ, he says, لا تحاسدوا ولا تناجشوا ولا تباغضوا ولا تدابروا ولا يبيع بعضكم على بيع بعض وكونوا عباد الله إخوانا. He says, do not envy one another, and do not inflate prices for one another, and do not hate one another, and do not turn away from one another, and do not undercut one another in trade, but rather be slaves of Allah and brothers amongst yourselves. He said, Al-Muslimu akhul Muslim. The Muslim is the brother of their fellow Muslims. La yadhlimu wa la yakhdhulu. He does not oppress one of the other, nor does he betray them. Wa la yahqiruhu. At-taqwa ha huna. He doesn't lie to them. He says piety is in the heart. And he pointed to his chest 3 times. He concluded this, he says, بِحَسَبِ امْرِئٍ مِّنَ الشَّرِّ أَن يَحْقِرَ أَخَاهُ الْمُسْلِمِ. It's evil enough of a Muslim to despise or to hate or disdain their fellow Muslims. He says, كُلُّ الْمُسْلِمْ عَلَى الْمُسْلِمْ حَرَامٌ. Each Muslim to the other is sanctified. دَمُهُ وَمَالُهُ وَعِرْضُهُ. His wealth, his life, and his honor, his dignity. It's preserved. That's something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has afforded each and every one of us in community life. That regardless the challenges or the disagreements, regardless the troubles and the trials that we go through as a community, much like a family, you don't shun away your brother or your sister. You don't seek to harm or destroy, but you preserve their honor and their dignity. Great lengths were taken to solidify and strengthen the Muslim community by our beloved Prophet ﷺ. Community institutions, they were established during that time. Building of the masjid as a central hub, a place of gathering and prayer. It was the focal point of the community, a place of worship, learning, meeting, and activity. And until this very day, that legacy lives on. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Man bana lillahi masjidan, bana Allahu lahu mithlahu fil jannah." It's reported by Imam at-Tirmidhi, whoever builds a house for Allah or a masjid for Allah, then Allah will build something similar for him in paradise. Likewise, congregational worship was legislated. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Salatul jama'ah afdalu min salatil fadhi bi 27 daraja." Praying in congregation is better and more rewarding than praying alone by 27 times, found in Sahih Bukhari wa Muslim. Brothers and sisters, think about it. In the very words that we recite in our prayers, the very words, we can feel the sense of community. In Al-Fatiha, we recite, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. It is you alone that we worship. It is you alone that we worship. And you alone we ask for help. Notice here, we are repeating daily in every prayer, we worship you. We, the Muslim community, the people of faith. It doesn't say, I worship you and I seek your help. Al-Fatiha has many, many inner dimensions and meanings to it. One of those is the essence of community life. Meeting community needs. was also obligated in our tradition, such as paying zakat, caring for the impoverished, adopting the orphan, and the many other social services found in the Islamic legislation, which are all a testament to the strong sense of community found within our faith. This is what we as a collective must focus on. If we can manage to hold it together in difficult times, we'll find ourselves supported. We have to focus on the collective. We cannot get fixated on one or two, but focus on the whole. And doing that, we will be supported, protected, and victorious. The Prophet ﷺ, he says, Yadullah ma'al jama'ah. The hand of Allah is with the congregation. It's with the greater body. It's with the community. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين من كل ذنب فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. بسم الله والحمد لله حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا فيه كما يحبه ربنا ويرضاه. نصلي ونسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. Brothers and sisters, the reality is that community life is very complex. Community life is very complex. The dynamics of a congregation of this size, the dynamics, they're very intricate. You can't sum them up in a word or two. You can't explain away those dynamics in a sentence or even a paragraph. Understanding why people act the way they do, how they make decisions, and how they respond is very complicated. Extremely complicated. And for that reason, we must afford each other a very wide lane to navigate through community life. It needs to be wide enough what it is that we afford others. We need to afford them the space to navigate through the community life that they want to lead, so much so that we can find excuses for one another, for the things that we do or don't do. We can find excuses and we can find a way to make the best assumptions. And of course, we can leave our hearts open for forgiveness in the event that we ourselves were wronged, as we would want to be forgiven in the event we wronged others. When things don't go your way in community life, or you're uncertain about decisions or direction, you don't become disenfranchised with faith. You don't give up on mosque life due to what a man or woman has done to you. And I'm not talking about anything specific. I'm talking about in general. There are a number of things that happen to us in community life with one other person or two or 5 or 10 where perhaps we feel like we were rubbed the wrong way. And we're ready to give it all up. We can't afford to wander alone. As people of faith, especially in our current context, in this society, we can't wander alone, isolating ourselves from our families of faith, removing the benefit that we can gain. Prophet ﷺ, he says, فَإِنَّمَا يَأْكُلُ ذِئْبُ الْقَاسِيَةِ. He says the wolf eats the lone sheep. Put it in Sunan Nasa'i. When you drift away from the community, you're susceptible. You're more vulnerable. And that's why you have to stick it out. We have to remember that as a community, we're bound to run into obstacles. There's no doubt. Just like your family, your close family or your extended relatives. You run into obstacles all of the time. But most of us, we don't give up because we're attached. Well, guess what? As Muslims, we're attached to each other. إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ إِخْوَةٌ. The believers, they're brothers. We're attached to each other, and so we cannot give up on one another. Brothers and sisters, living a life filled with test and trial, we cannot allow obstacles to drive us away from learning our faith and worshiping Allah. We're here for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Hayyul Qayyum, the ever-living and sustainer of all. Regardless of the challenges that we go through, that intention is fundamentally important to our success as a community. You have come here for the sake of Allah. When you visit a place of worship, whether this or anywhere else, you don't go seeking the acknowledgement of others, but you go seeking the reward of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Your heart is attached to Allah. It is attached to such a place because of Allah, not attached to its caretakers. Whether it be the one standing in front of you now today, or the one that comes behind tomorrow, the one that's working in the office, behind the scenes, your heart is not attached to the caretakers. But your heart is attached to Allah, and so such obstacles do not trip you up and push you out. Brothers and sisters, I ask you to be consistent in your communal worship. And never underestimate the value of community. Never underestimate the benefits of brotherhood, so that you do not turn away from it out of frustrations. We ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us success in this life and the next, and that He make us strong through our adversities and not weaker. We ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deliver us from any communal unrest, and that He protect us from those who seek to harm us, that He guide our hearts to that which He loves and is pleased with. وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين.